Ladies and gentlemen, hello everyone. I am Mr.Fang Sheng. Today I want to talk to you about a fervent campaign once initiated by the former Soviet Union, the Corn Crusade. We all understand the principle that food is the foundation of the people, and this is especially true for a country ravaged by famine and war in modern times. The Soviet Union is a prime example of this. In the first half of the 20th century, the Soviet Union experienced various wars and famines. So when the situation stabilized a bit in the 1950s, the Soviet leader at that time, Khrushchev, came up with an idea to solve the Soviet Union's food problem: the widespread cultivation of corn. Why corn? Why not something else? In fact, Khrushchev had already developed a deep affection for corn long before he became the highest leader of the Soviet Union. This was largely due to his experience governing Ukraine after World War II. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and it should have been the last place to suffer from famine. However, before World War II, a genocidal famine occurred here due to Stalin's irrational agricultural policies. And during the war, the German army occupied Ukraine for a long time and carried out a scorched earth policy when they retreated, causing great damage to Ukrainian agriculture. Although the Soviet Union won the war in 1945, famine remained a serious problem in Ukraine and even the entire Soviet Union, with isolated incidents of cannibalism occurring in some places. The Soviet leadership at the time was very eager to solve this problem and came up with many ideas. For example, Lysenko, a biologist particularly favored by Stalin, promoted the vernalization of wheat, claiming it would completely solve the food problem, but in the end, it turned out to be a farce. At that time, Khrushchev was governing Ukraine, and he regarded the food issue as a top priority. Not completely trusting Lysenko's misguided commands, he discovered a method to optimize corn yields through trial and error. This was the square hole planting method, which involved dividing the land into several squares, each square into several holes, and then planting clusters of plants at intervals in the holes. Under Khrushchev's leadership, Ukrainian farmers used this method to grow corn locally, and the result was a great success. Starting in 1948, Ukraine exceeded its grain quotas, a remarkable achievement in the Soviet Union at that time, and Khrushchev, who was governing Ukraine, naturally took the credit. This success led to his transfer to Moscow, where he joined the center of power, marking the first time he tasted the sweetness of corn. In Moscow, Khrushchev continued his experiments by promoting corn cultivation on 2 collective farms near his residence. The grain yield on these farms also showed a significant increase. With these successful experiments, Khrushchev gained considerable confidence. After Stalin's death in 1953, Khrushchev gradually became the highest leader of the Soviet Union through a series of strategic moves. As the head of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a dream: to completely solve the food problem, ensuring that the entire nation not only had enough to eat, but also ate well. According to his theory, corn could be mass-produced, and with increased yields, it would not only feed the people, but also provide better nutrition for livestock. This way, there would be plenty of beef stew with potatoes and corn on the cob, a wonderful socialist vision. Consequently, Khrushchev began vigorously promoting corn cultivation. Since the top leader had spoken, officials at all levels quickly and zealously promoted corn cultivation with an intensity and fervor that resembled a crusade. In 1953, the total area of corn cultivation in the Soviet Union was only 3.5 million hectares. By 1955, it had increased to 18 million hectares. By the early 1960s, the area had expanded to over 37 million hectares, accounting for 1/6 of the total sown area in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, various posters and propaganda materials extolling the virtues of corn were everywhere. With the advent of corn, not only were the people smiling, but even the livestock seemed pleased. Dairy cows were practically beaming. In short, with the arrival of corn, everything seemed auspicious. Khrushchev's corn dream seemed unstoppable and was advancing with great momentum. But in 1959, he faced a harsh reality check. The blow came not from within, but from the Soviet Union's biggest ideological enemy at the time, America. In September of that year, U.S. President Eisenhower invited Khrushchev to visit, and since Khrushchev had a particular interest in corn, he made sure to visit a corn farm in Iowa. The United States had a long history of corn cultivation, with a highly commercialized and integrated industry chain that included everything from planting to processing and procurement, far more advanced than anything in the Soviet Union. This deeply shocked Khrushchev. The Soviet Union was supposed to surpass the United States in every aspect. And since corn was something Khrushchev personally championed, it was unacceptable for it to fall behind. After returning home, he decided to promote corn cultivation with even greater vigor, authorizing the establishment of a dedicated corn exhibition hall at the Moscow Exhibition Center and even opening a specialized corn store in Moscow. As the saying goes, what the leader likes, his subordinates will pursue with even greater enthusiasm. Seeing Khrushchev's firm determination to promote corn, someone quickly stepped up to show unwavering support. This person was Larionov, the governor of Ryazan Oblast. Governor Larionov boldly pledged to fulfill Khrushchev's mission and achieved the remarkable feat of tripling meat production within a year, a feat that was hailed at the time as the Ryazan miracle. But what extraordinary methods did this governor use to achieve such a feat? Increasing corn production in Ryazan Oblast was no easy task, and using that corn to feed cattle and sheep to increase meat production was even more challenging. However, these objective difficulties did not dampen the governor's determination to advance. To meet the meat production targets set by the higher-ups, Ryazan Oblast took a bold shortcut. They slaughtered all existing livestock, including dairy cows. They even resorted to exaggerating and falsifying production reports. It can be said that in order to complete the mission, they were willing to do whatever it took, even if it meant killing the goose that laid the golden eggs or causing long-term harm. Unfortunately, Khrushchev was unaware of the true situation in Ryazan. He only saw the superficial success of the Ryazan miracle and went on to heavily promote and commend it, even awarding the governor the prestigious Lenin Medal. However, the Ryazan miracle couldn't be sustained. All the livestock in the entire oblast had already been sent to the slaughterhouse, and even if every last mouse were caught, it still wouldn't be enough to meet the quota. But the military orders were still in effect, and Governor Larionov had no choice but to scour other regions for livestock to barely scrape by. Once the livestock from other areas were exhausted, the time came for the Ryazan miracle to be exposed as a sham. Eventually, the truth came out, and Larionov was stripped of his Lenin Medal and all honors. To avoid taking responsibility, he ultimately committed suicide. Of course, the Ryazan miracle was not an isolated case at the time. In order to meet the target set by Khrushchev, many local officials resorted to deception, with some even secretly importing corn from foreign countries to make up the numbers. But no matter what they did, it was impossible to meet Khrushchev's targets. By the 1960s, even though the area under corn cultivation in the Soviet Union continued to expand, corn yields plummeted. Khrushchev's explanation for this was that there are some factors among our cadres that are hindering the increase in corn production. This statement made everyone suddenly recall the days of Stalin, when no one knew whether they might be sent to Siberia to dig potatoes. But even if they hunted down internal enemies, the corn yields simply wouldn't rise. By the early 1960s, after several years of the vigorous corn campaign, the Soviet Union once again faced a food shortage and was forced to purchase grain from Western countries. By this time, Khrushchev's corn campaign had completely failed. The Soviet people, who were deeply resentful of him, gave him the nickname Kukuruznik, which is Russian for corn cob. It was obvious to any clear-sighted person that this corn campaign was unscientific. How could the great Soviet Union, the leader of the socialist bloc and a superpower that could stand against the United States of America, end up engaging in such an absurd undertaking? In fact, although the Soviet Union had vast territories, most of them were harsh, cold lands, naturally unsuitable for growing corn. If corn was forcefully promoted in such regions, disregarding the natural conditions, it would result in a total failure, especially in places like Siberia and Kamchatka. Khrushchev's experiences in Ukraine were not widely applicable across the expansive Soviet territory. However, who dared to question the leader's successful experiences? Who would dare to say, "Comrade leader, Your success has its limitations, just like Newton's classical mechanics has its limitations. When the environmental conditions change, it no longer applies. The political and public opinion environment in the Soviet Union at the time left no one daring to say such things to him. Moreover, large-scale corn cultivation requires a substantial amount of fertilizers, and the Soviet Union's fertilizer industry was far from adequate. This was the fundamental reason why, despite the extensive area under corn cultivation, yields continuously declined. The cost of producing corn per unit area in the Soviet Union was several times higher than that in the United States. Under such circumstances, the idea of using corn to feed livestock was, of course, even more impractical. At this point, some people might find this scenario somewhat familiar. That's right, China's Great Leap Forward movement during the same period followed a similar script, but with an even more tragic outcome. The Soviet Union at least had a relatively developed industrial sector and was merely focusing on an agricultural campaign. In China, however, both industrial and agricultural campaigns were pursued simultaneously. The Great Leap Forward saw the industrial campaign of mass steel production and the agricultural campaign of communal farming, leading to a nationwide economic and social movement that impacted every aspect of life in China. After several years, not only did China fail to develop, but it also caused severe damage to both agricultural and industrial production. While the Soviet corn campaign was a major failure, it only affected parts of the Soviet Union. In contrast, the scale and impact of China's Great Leap Forward far surpassed the corn campaign, ultimately leading to a devastating famine across the entire country. From 1959 to 1961, it is conservatively estimated that between 15 million and 45 million people starved to death. Looking back at the Soviet Union's corn crusade today, the causes, process, outcomes, objectives, problems, and implications are all quite clear. However, it is always easier to see the problems of others. The real challenge lies in how we can see our own issues. All right, that's all for today. I'm Mr. Fang Sheng. Thank you for watching, and please feel free to subscribe to my channel.